Hey, Twitter. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Xavier Harding, and I'm a writer here on the content team at Mozilla. This is now the second time I've worn a shirt that I would wear outside. I'm not happy about that, but we have a great discussion planned for you today. But before we jump in, some quick background. A lot of us are full-time home right now, whether that be working from home, researching from home, networking from home, even hanging out with friends separately, virtually from home. So with that in mind, many of the events that Mozilla's internet health movement looks forward to each and every year are either being canceled or postponed. So that's why Mozilla is taking its MozFest events and speaker series, dialogues and debates virtual. It's a chance for us to continue the important conversations about online privacy, trustworthy AI, big tech, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So today's dialogues and debates, very special dialogues and debates for you today. It's called Trustworthy Technology in the Time of a Pandemic and features a London-based Mozilla fellow, Frederike Kaltheuner. Frederike works on trustworthy AI and how it can be biased. Before Mozilla, Frederike was a director at Privacy International in London, has given expert advice to European Parliament, Belgian Parliament, and much more. So today we're hoping to talk about the ways coronavirus has unexpectedly crossed paths with the internet and technology. Some things that people are wondering, how do I have to trade my privacy to protect my health? Are social media sites profiting from fake news about coronavirus? How secure are video chat apps that we use to do work and hang out with friends? So folks watching at home can do so live, as you're probably doing right now. You can tweet at us using the hashtag trustworthy technology. We put the hashtag sign in front of it. So let's get started with our first question. Are you ready, Frederike?
I'm ready.
Okay, cool. So have any countries emerged as kind of leaders in protecting both public health and privacy? And if so, are there any countries who are exhibiting truly terrible, bad privacy practices as their response to this pandemic? Like, it's absolutely awful.
What I like about this question is that it dives right into the question, should we balance privacy? How should we balance public health and privacy? And before we deconstruct this, I just want to say that I think it goes without saying that sort of anyone who's lost the job is worried about the health of loved ones or is finding it incredibly hard to be in isolation. We all want this to be over and as soon as possible. So I think the moment we start framing this entire debate as privacy versus public health, it's clear who the winner is. We all want public health to win at this point in time. So the question is not which one wins, but the question is that the right question to be asking in the first place? And I think the answer is mostly no. It is not true that there's an inevitable trade-off between privacy on the one hand and public health on the others. Just simply not true. And a good example for something that will probably come up later again is the case of contact tracing apps. The question is not, what's the trade-off, but there are many different ways of building these apps. So I think the real question is, what role, if any, should technology play in fighting the virus? What is actually evidence-based and effective? And how can we use technology in a way that's responsible and trustworthy? Something that I also think is important when we talk about responsible or trustworthy technology in general, privacy definitely plays a part. It's sort of a necessary ingredient, but it's not alone sufficient to make technology responsible. So we need to talk about a lot more rights than just privacy in this crisis. And finally, sort of this sort of privacy versus public health has really been annoying me because it also assumes that privacy is something that's completely absolute. So you either have privacy or you don't. But what's interesting is that even international human rights law recognizes that in an emergency like a public health crisis, some rights can be restricted. But the question is, this is only possible under a long list of conditions. And I just want to throw some in. One condition is this has to be strictly necessary. This has to be lawful. It can't be it has to be of limited duration, and it has to be respectful of human dignity, et cetera, et cetera. So I think I would really love to shift the debate more towards whatever rights we're currently restricting, and we're restricting much more than just privacy. How are these restrictions justified? What's the oversight? What's the limit? And how can we just use technology responsibly?
Yeah, that's a very good question. This next question is kind of US centric, but it could be broadened out. One of the consequences of September 11th back in the day was the creation of a mass surveillance network, unlike any other we've seen before. How likely is it that coronavirus could do something similar?
I can't predict the future. I can only say that I would not want this to happen. But I think I've heard this come up several times, sort of what are the parallels? And there are two caveats I think we need to throw in. The first one is, yes, 9/11 has really led to mass surveillance, but it also led to something very different, which is targeted surveillance of certain kinds of communities, particularly Muslims. So it's not just mass surveillance that's the problem, so is discrimination of certain groups in society. When we talk about this parallel, something that keeps irritating me is sort of the use of war language and metaphors, because a pandemic is not the same as a war or even as a terrorist incident. It's something completely different. And the German president, in a speech, he put this very eloquently when he said, and I'm paraphrasing sort of, but he said, this is not a war. There are no nations fighting against each other. There are no soldiers. This is sort of a crisis of humanity. So the lesson we should draw from this, I hope, is not sort of surveillance. Surveillance is not going to fix this. But when we look around and see sort of the countries that are dealing with this better than others, they allow people who are sick to stay home when they're sick. They give people access to healthcare. So this is about something entirely different. It's really more about sort of social justice and inequality. And I really hope that we take this away from this crisis and not more surveillance, because it just would really miss the point.
Yeah, and on that same note, I'll use a face mask sometimes when I'm outside, and my phone's Face ID doesn't work. When we start to think about people wearing masks in public for kind of the rest of the year, maybe even the foreseeable future, does this mean that facial recognition tech is now a lot less accurate just in general, or kind of in other words, are masks protecting both our privacy and our immune systems at the same time? Like, could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are making the experience that they suddenly can't unlock their phones anymore. And the hope is obviously that, does that also mean that face recognition won't recognize me in public? But these are different kinds of application of face recognition, so they work slightly differently. The idea of masks and people covering their face, that's not a new research topic for biometrics researchers and AI researchers, because also in a lot of sensitive contexts like protests, people wear masks, they cover their faces. And there's already been a paper in 2017 that showed people who partially cover their face can be recognized at an accuracy that's higher than chance, basically. So I think there were a couple of companies, a Chinese company that now came out and said, yes, we fine-tuned our systems, we are able to recognize people even if they're covering their face. So the answer is, unfortunately, a face mask is not going to give you more privacy in public. But
Wait,
it
how are
is
people
also
being
really
recognized without their face? Like, how is that happening?
sort of what's interesting is the face is just one way in which we're unique. Sort of in the initial paper, they were sort of modeling how people would look like with their mouth covered. But also the industry is actually moving away or expanding from faces and using things like gait recognition or vein recognition. So there are a lot of things about us that make us unique that allows cameras to recognize us. So the face is just one. But I think the bigger lesson is, I don't think hiding from surveillance tech, this can always be a strategy and a mix of tools, but it's never going to be the solution. The solution is going to be, and I'm obviously biased because I work in policy, but I think for me, the solution is always, we need to have better laws that protect us. It can't be our full-time job to hide from whatever tech or surveillance industry has come up next.
So better laws, but in the meantime, hide your veins because they will find you. The next question is, it's a little bit more of a basic question. And we actually had a panel about this last week that you were also on, that I also hosted. What is contact tracing in technological terms? And that one's from VS Cath on Twitter.
All right. Before I answer this, I want to go back and say, tech has been talking about contact tracing to the extent that I'm almost a little tired of the debate. But the contact tracing actually comes from epidemiology. And if you look at the WHO's core strategy in fighting this pandemic, It's isolating cases, it's testing people, and it is tracing their contacts. And the entire reason is you want to break the transmission chains between people. And traditionally, contact tracing has been done or is still being done everywhere by health authorities. So when you test positive, they try to figure out where you've been, people you've been in touch with. And we've all read these early stories at the beginning of the pandemic where we read the person who traveled there and there. The problem of this is that obviously, the more cases you have, the more difficult, even if you hire thousands or tens of thousands of people, this because it's incredibly labor intensive and it becomes a little difficult. And this is where technology comes in. But whatever system, and sort of to answer the question, there are different technologies that are currently being discussed as solutions. But before we even talk about this, I think it's important to recognize that any sort of tech that does the contact tracing has inherent limitations. So any kind of contact tracing app, no matter how it's built or made, always has the limitation that not everybody has a phone, not everybody uses a phone that they don't share with other people, and not everybody sort of takes their phone with them at all times. And then there's also the question of how accurate is the contact tracing. So there is a margin of error. And it's also important to say that this is something that's inherently risky. This is incredibly invasive. So if there wasn't a pandemic at the moment, we would never accept an app that would track us and trace everywhere we've gone and everyone we've met. So this is very risky. So if epidemiologists, and it's up to them to decide whether this is actually useful, and they keep saying, well, it is actually useful, then the question is, how can we deploy this in a way that is most responsible, that is sort of like trustworthy, in a way that we can actually trust this app? Because I think that the core principle always has to be that such an app has to be voluntary. So it's up to the designers of the app to design something that is worthy of our trust.
Yeah, you make such a good point. Like the idea that if you don't have a smartphone, you don't get to have health. Like the assumption that everyone just has a smartphone. Like to be able to be part of this global experiment of contact tracing, you have to be able to afford this $400, $500, $600 or more device.
I think, and it goes even further, not all phones have the technical capability to do the kind of tracing we're talking about. But also sort of, if you as a country, if there are not enough tests, then there's no way for me to notify people that I'm sick. And if I can't isolate because I don't have physical space to actually isolate myself, then sort of I can get the notification that I might be sick, but I can't really draw any consequences from this. So there are so many assumptions built around this that sort of whatever role this plays, it will only ever supplement all the other strategies. So this is not going to be the silver bullet. And at the same time, it's so invasive and so risky that we do need to have a conversation about how should such an app look like and what's the most sort of the lowest risk, most responsible way of deploying it.
Yeah. Yeah, the assumptions part is always kind of like the Achilles heel of tech. So on the topic of contact tracing, we have a question from Creative Commons on Twitter, which is, a three-parter. So get ready. What data will be collected? How will it be shared? And who owns the data? Is that something we know? What can you tell us about that?
So there are lots of varieties of this that are being discussed. On the part of the question was who owns the data. I think data ownership is something that's being discussed as a solution to give us more control over data. And I personally don't think that's the right solution, not just in this context. So whatever solution we think about, what you need both technical safeguards and you need legal safeguards. And the technical safeguards are such an app processes health data, which is a technical way of saying it just holds data that reveal a lot about your health, such as whether you tested positive for the coronavirus. So such an app needs to be extremely secure. It can't have anything like advertising trackers. That's not even that should not even be on the table. It should collect as little data as possible. It should use pseudonymous data, so ID is not your real name. And something that has been discussed a lot is there is a centralized version of this and a decentralized version. And there are a lot of arguments in favor of the decentralized version. So it's a bit technical, but to summarize,
and when you say centralized and decentralized, what does that mean exactly? In case I'm not someone who doesn't know.
Sure. So the question is, we've seen some very dystopian versions of this app. I don't really want to go into detail, but for example, sort of like at very early in the debate, there were discussions about an app that uses GPS and collects your entire movement history and hence everybody you've interacted with and shares this with a centralized server. And we don't even know how secure this is. So I think this is extremely dangerous. And the discussion has moved away from this. What's currently being discussed is sort of contact tracing using Bluetooth technology. And the advantage of this is you don't collect data about your movements. You only collect data about your interactions with people who also have the app. So now the difference between the decentralized, and I'm really, really summarizing here, and the centralized version is where should this data be processed and stored? So in the decentralized model, it all stays on your phone. You have a changing ID that changes contact key. And whenever you meet someone, you exchange the ID. So my phone knows who I have met. When I then find out and I get tested that I am sick, I can notify people who I have been in touch with, but they won't know who it was and where it was and when it was. So the centralized question is, should this data also be shared centrally? And should there be a way for, let's say, health authorities to find out who somebody was in touch with or not? And the decentralized version doesn't do that because it only stays on your phone. And the advantages of this was more that the potential for misuse are significantly lower. Because whenever you have such data on a centralized server, the question is, what is going to happen to this data? How long is it going to be stored, etc. So I left out many of the details in case somebody on Twitter gets angry with me. So this is like the broad. But I also think the technical safeguards, and I also think privacy and security is crucial in this debate. But there are so many other dimensions to this. And something that I'm worried about is I think this app should be something like this has to be voluntary. It has to be time limited, but we also need things like oversight. And we also don't want police stopping people and asking them, do you have this app? So nobody should be punished for not having a phone, for not having their phone charged, for not using the app, etc. But those are legal questions. They're not technical questions. So a responsible contact tracing app, which is only ever going to be one piece of the big puzzle of things that need to happen. A responsible app needs to have the strongest possible technical safeguards, but it also needs legal protections.
Yeah, you got into this a little bit, and we're actually going to move on from contact tracing soon. But I wanted to get into this question from Whole Milk on Twitter because Whole Milk got a question in the last panel. Shout out to Whole Milk. So the last question, you mentioned centralized model. Like, do you think that data that they collect via contact tracing could ever be used for marketing purposes? And I think your answer was kind of like, if it's centralized, like who knows what they could like use that data for?
I think it's important you might trust your government where you currently live, or you don't. But I think whatever app you use, it has to be interoperable, which means that if you travel abroad, it's sort of, if we want to loosen restrictions, it has to work. Like the virus doesn't know borders, basically. So the question is really, it doesn't really matter whether you trust your governments. We know that there are governments that are not really trustworthy. So sort of like a trustworthy technology means we don't want to blindly trust something that it is built in a way that the risk is as minimized as possible. On the marketing question, someone has done an amazing job. I'll tweet out their name. So a French group has done an amazing job of testing all the existing Corona apps that are out there. And it was quite shocking to see that many of the early apps included advertising trackers, which I think is completely unacceptable. So there was a symptom checker which shared sort of all the symptoms you put into the app, which shared this data with advertisers. That's obviously unacceptable, especially in countries that lack laws to protect people's data. And if this data ends up with insurance companies or employers, like that's a really a nightmare that shouldn't happen. So absolutely no. This is not that's just not the time.
Right, it's not appropriate. You're probably tired of talking about contact tracing between last week's panel and this question right now, so we can move on from this. A question from Jacob Kleiman on Twitter is about kind of a little bit more broad in general, but back in the day, I would never use my webcam. I kept it blocked all the time for security reasons. Now I use my webcam every day for all kinds of work and friend calls, but I still sometimes cover it up in between meetings at the end of the day. Is that a legitimate concern, or is that just paranoia? What do you think about that?
Before I answer that question, I just want to correct what I said about contact tracing, because I think the risk for abuse is like, this is incredibly risky. So it's very, very important that we're having this discussion. And it's disheartening to see that some governments are not opting for the decentralized version, but they are opting for the way more privacy invasive version. That's really, really concerning. When I say I'm a bit tired of it, like the more we talk about it, the more it sounds like this is the solution, when everybody says it's only ever going to be a part of the solution. So I'm a little bit torn in. I want to talk about, like, this has to be done the right way. It has to be trustworthy. But at the same time, we also really, really shouldn't overhype this, especially as someone who's not even I'm not an epidemiologist, but this is not my expertise. But on the other question, so someone asked about covering the webcam. So the reason why, like, lots of digital rights organizations recommend to you to cover your webcam is that your webcam can be hacked. So you can't even, usually when you turn your webcam on, a light pops up and you know that it's on, but it can be hacked in a way that you don't even notice. So that's the reason why the recommendation is always to cover your camera. But of course, it really depends on your individual circumstances. So there were images of Mark Zuckerberg covering his camera. The former FBI director, James Comey, said that he covers his camera, but these are high-risk individuals and they are a target. So the recommendation is to do it, but it obviously depends on your circumstances, whether you think that's right for you. But I would always say there are very useful sliders where you can just slide it on and off. So when you need your camera, you just slide it open, and otherwise you turn it off.
Are you trying to say that Jacob Kleiman is not a high-risk individual? Maybe he's like this famous person.
I'm saying that I don't know. It's sort of, with our security questions, it's very context specific. So it's like, he has to judge what his situation is.
That's true. So at Tor Data Mocap on Twitter, hopefully I didn't screw up that pronunciation, how exposed is our privacy during the lockdown? What consequences will the COVID emergency have on our daily lives?
I think privacy is one of the many things we need to be worried about. So during this pandemic, a lot of very important rights have currently been restricted. So think about the right to protest. There were protest movements around the world that have currently come to a pause, and obviously rightfully so, because it would be very dangerous to have masses of people outside protesting. But it's important to remember that the right to protest is a really, really important right. So I think as with all rights, not just privacy, the question is, we really need to monitor how governments are restricting rights currently. And it needs to be, all of these restrictions need to be necessary, there needs to be oversight, and they need to be time limited. And the reason is, autocrats love emergencies, because in emergencies, the normal rules don't apply. So the normal rules, where you have a free press, where you have protests, this is very convenient also that all of these things are currently, well, free press, yes, but sort of that protest and things like this are currently not possible. So I am quite worried. I am a little worried about this. And I think that's why I think the emphasis on privacy is sort of, yes, I care about privacy, but there are so many other things I also care about, and all of them need our sort of like collective. We really need to watch out for these things and see how they are being, whether their restrictions are really necessary and proportionate and not being abused.
You raise a good point about how, for certain folks, a pandemic is like a prime opportunity to strike, because one thing to keep in mind is, like, some of this stuff might stick around after the pandemic is finished.
I think what happened in Hungary, I think, is concerning. There's no justification for an unlimited suspension of parliament and an extension of power. That sort of like, that's really, really disproportionate. And something else to talk to someone in, governments have found different ways. Someone in Dubai told me that in order to leave the house, the government deploys automatic license plate reading. So in order to go to the supermarket, you need a request to be allowed to pass. And when I listened to this, I thought, yes, obviously in a pandemic, I see why they are doing this. And then you can automatically exclude, like, trucks and essential workers. They automatically have the right to pass. But my thought was immediately, well, that's also very convenient in a very different circumstance, like protest. So yes, I think there are, especially when it comes to tech. So a lot of things that appear to be very useful at the moment, thermal cameras that measure people's temperature, once they're installed, they're there, and then they can be abused for other purposes.
That's true. We have a question from @Gemini Matt on Twitter. Shout out Matt Mitchell. And it's more of a, not quite only about coronavirus, just kind of more in general. Should we be concerned about AI systems that classify, judge, and evaluate people's identities, feelings, emotions? How advanced is this technology in 2020?
I like this question because this is sort of like, that was my original Mozilla project. And the reason I picked this is that what I find fascinating about this is that it really opens our eyes to the dual challenge of automated data processing. So when these kinds of predictions are accurate, they're incredibly invasive. So there are predictive systems that classify my sexual orientation, my gender, my interests. But at the same time, they are only predictions. So when they're wrong, that comes with its own challenges. And I used to say it's sort of Orwellian when it's accurate and it's Kafkaesque when it isn't, which means that these systems can classify you as something that you don't even know that it's happening. You don't necessarily agree with it, but it still has consequences and it's largely invisible. And that's why I think this is really interesting. And what I'm looking at in my research at the moment is there are many so-called alternative credit scoring companies that are targeted for people who don't have a bank account. So they don't have enough data to make use of traditional credit scoring. So what these companies do is they analyze all of their data, so their phone metrics, who they call, but also sometimes make use of things like personality predictions, so predicting people's personality to decide if someone gets a loan. And if this works, it's sort of like, well, it means that if you think about it, it means that people with a certain personality can't qualify for a loan. But if it doesn't work, it also means that the system just classified you as something and you don't even know what happened. So I think in general, a lot of the AI discussions were about bias and discrimination, but I really would love to shift the debate a little bit towards what can AI do and what can AI not do. And predicting your identity is something, there's an inherent limit because you're the ultimate authority over your identity. It doesn't matter whether a system says what my sexual orientation is, it might be very different because it's really just up to me. So I think that's really, what are things that really AI just can't do because it's only ever going to be a guess.
One question I kind of just have personally myself, going back to what you said earlier about all the ways that AI can detect my identity, not just with my face. Even if my face is covered, you can look at how I walk, you can look at my vein patterns, which is absolutely wild. But then we also look at the number of people, at least in the US, how Black citizens have been more at risk to coronavirus than certain others. My fear is that would they ever use AI to detect who might be more susceptible to coronavirus? Will they just kind of be looking at, okay, who's Black, who's not? Is that something I should be afraid of?
I mean, we already know who's most at risk, right? It's sort of, we know that the people who can't work from home, who can't have Zoom meetings and do sound over it, people who have to, people who are essential workers are most at risk, and people who are generally marginalized. If you're poor, if you lived in cramped living spaces, then you're most at risk. And in many parts of the world, this sort of coincides with people's race, and that means that certain people are at a higher risk. So we don't need AI to answer this question, because it's sort of like, it's not an AI kind of question. It's a statistical question where we can see who's most affected. I think, what's the role of AI in this? I don't think a crisis is necessarily a time where you want to use untested technology to experiment, basically. I haven't looked into this in detail. There's what role AI can or cannot play in this crisis, but I'm always very suspicious when this crisis is seen as a business opportunity to try something out, because really, really, we don't want to be trying with people's lives and their health at the moment.
Yeah, and my worst case scenario fear is like an app that just says, okay, this person's an essential worker, watch out for them. This person's Black, watch out for them. That probably maybe is not feasible, but should I be worried about that? Probably.
No, I think it is. I think all of these privacy discussions, what they're really about is the reason why I think the reason why we need privacy is that we don't want people to be segmented and excluded and discriminated against. So there was a case in Kenya where someone was beaten to death because some other people suspected they had coronavirus. Or sort of like if we sort of, there is a scenario where, I don't know, certain people have immunity, other people don't, so they're treated differently. Or like, you know, you test positive and you infected other people, and then they exclude, like there are like so many terrible possibilities of things that can go wrong. And this is why the tech we use needs to be really, really, really respectful, not just of privacy, but of all sorts of rights, to keep that in mind.
Yeah. We got a question from the Panopticon Foundation on Twitter. What are the risks of immunity certificates becoming the condition of our access to public and social life? Do you want to explain a little bit what immunity certificates are and then answer the question?
So there was in a lot of English media, there were claims that Germany is planning on introducing immunity passports, which was sort of initially a weird translation. So there are immunity studies, and one of the lead researchers said that yes, potentially we could issue some of the people who participated an immunity passport, but that's just sort of a piece of paper, basically. There are some private companies who are really, really interested in our pushing this idea. But what I think is important is that the WHO has said very clearly, they're warning very clearly against immunity certificates. And the reason for this is, from their perspective, which is not my area of expertise, but their perspective is that immunity to the coronavirus and to COVID-19 is an ongoing area of research. We simply don't know yet if people will be immune, and if yes, for how long. And as long as we don't know this, that's very difficult. And the second part is that many of the immunity tests aren't very accurate. So sort of like we can't even measure it, and we don't even know how long it lasts. And until these two criteria aren't met, I find it very strange that we're already talking about immunity certificates when the basic fundamentals aren't there. What worries me is that we just rush to deploy this without the evidence that there's any sense in it. There's also sort of an identity industry that's very, very interested in pushing for a digital identity that centralizes lots of different parts of our life in an identity. So this is something to be worried about. And then finally, I think, again, this isn't about privacy. It's more, how are we going to treat people who are immune? Are we going to give people certain privileges and advantages and other people not? So this is really, there are some very scary implications of this idea that I'm personally very skeptical and quite worried about.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Because not everybody.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and also sort of like, so what does that mean? Is it sort of, does that mean that people will try to get sick so that they are immune? That's really, really not what we want. Or there are also certain people who are so at risk that they really cannot be sick. So what about these people? They never get an immunity passport. So it raises so many crucial questions that, yeah, I currently find this very, very concerning. Plus, if the WHO warns against it, why are we having this discussion?
Yeah, it's just crazy the ways we rush to stratify society. Like, it seems like you would issue those as a way to treat certain people better and certain people worse, is what it seems like.
Which we're already doing in a society, but it's sort of, right? It's not, somebody really smart on Twitter said the other day, we're not in the same boat, but we're all in the same storm, and we have different kinds of boats. And I think that captured the entire pandemic quite well. But then adding immunity certificates on top of this, you again have the question, who will have access to these immunity tests? Will it be all the celebrities who are again like, I have an immunity passport, and other people who don't? So it's sort of, this is already such an equality question that adding this on top just sounds, concerning.
Coronavirus has shown me that if the apocalypse went down, it would only be like rich folks who survived and like folks with access to like, it's just, okay, so next question. It's just crazy. Yeah. So next question. Some good tech policy ideas have been gaining momentum in the US. We have, and before the pandemic, not just after the pandemic, the CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act, the Honest Ads Act. These are things that were kind of gaining some ground before coronavirus hit. Have privacy initiatives like this completely stalled as a result of the pandemic?
So everything is on hold at the moment, and it's sort of that's why we also need this to be over, because everything is on hold, and that means lots of important issues aren't deserving the attention they need. I still think that the pandemic shows us how urgently countries that lack comprehensive privacy and data protection laws actually need them. And something I read the other day that worried me in the US, which does not have a comprehensive data protection law. There's the California law, and there are sort of there's a law about healthcare data, but healthcare data is very narrowly defined. It doesn't cover things like browsing data that reveals information about your health. It's really strictly about medical information. And as a result of this, lots of browsing tracking data that actually reveals whether you're depressed, what your health status is up for grabs. So this is something where I'm really worried about what are advertisers like. We've already seen that data brokers now offer targeting categories for how people are dealing with the pandemic. And that's not health data, but this is like anxious or like stockpiling or like bored at home. And it's like, again, the potential for abuse is really high. But what's also really important is sort of what rights do employees have in the workplace? I'm worried that companies will say, well, and this would not be allowed like this under European laws, but that employers say, if you want to come back to work, you need to install this very invasive app, you need to wear a bracelet, and you need to you need to share all your health data with me. That's really, really concerning, because will you get fired if you test positive? And there are very good reasons why workers need privacy protection of their health data. So this is just one of the many reasons where I hope that this will not put an end to these debates, but that it will sort of give them more, a greater sense of urgency. It's not coronavirus.
Bless you. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Allergies.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Please clarify, corona over there.
No.
Yeah, and when
knows?
it comes to,
No.
Or who knows? I mean, that's true. I hope no corona over there.
Which is another limitation of the contact tracing apps. If you're asymptomatic, you will probably not get tested. So that's another limitation.
That's true. That's a very good point. So, going back to this sort of broad overreaching tech policy, GDPR is something that has passed and has been set in stone over in Europe. Will GDPR help thwart any privacy overreaches that EU governments attempt in response to the pandemic?
So GDPR is a good base. It offers a baseline of protection, not more and not less. But it's also sort of, there are many exemptions, for example, especially when it comes to governments. So for example, for national security reasons, for migration purposes, the standards are a lot lower for certain government applications, and many EU member states have made use of that to pass local laws that give them certain exemptions. And a health crisis is certainly a crisis that sort of is adjusted. It's sort of like that's a special kind of situation. So I think when it comes to companies processing data, yes, it's great to have GDPR, because it means that, at least in theory, health apps are not allowed to have advertising trackers within them. But I've done a study in my last jobs with my colleague Elliot. We have looked at sort of the kind of data that health websites about depression specifically share with advertisers. And we were very shocked to learn that, and we only looked at European websites in the UK, in Germany, and in France. And we were really shocked to find out that an incredible amount of websites about health shared health data with advertisers. So it's only ever going to be the baseline GDPR. And there is a massive enforcement gap. So there is a problem that some of the DPAs have been very active, and it's great to have this framework. But when it comes to sort of like the enforcement, there's still sort of like a gap. So the answer is yes, definitely, but it's not gonna solve everything. And especially on the coronavirus app, Lillian Edwards, she's a professor in the UK. She worked on a proposal for a bill on the contact tracing app, because she says, no, GDPR isn't enough. You really need specific safeguards to protect people.
Yeah. On the topic of apps, the next question is, what messaging and video conference, and this is actually something we've been talking about on the content team a bit. What messaging and video conference apps do you suggest that privacy-minded people use in this moment when they're working from home, when they're doing everything from home?
I don't like to recommend products because, again, sort of people's threat model is kind of different. And what threat model means is sort of who you're afraid of and what you're should be afraid of really depends on your situation. So if you're a therapist and you're offering counseling or therapy online, you need a different level of protection than when you're just talking to your grandma about cooking. But what I think a lot of companies, there is a real risk. As a lot of companies are working remotely, a lot of sensitive topics are being discussed on Zoom calls, for example. So I think something like corporate espionage, this is really, really important for companies, that the technology they use is very secure. I think currently, like, the reason why people were rushing to Zoom is that there's a lack of a really, really, really good solution. There's like Jitsi Meet, there's an open source one, but then it's not that reliable. So there are all of these solutions that are currently around, I personally find, have their different trade-offs.
So an issue of correction there. My grandma's cooking recipes are highly confidential. So
Fair enough.
some people, it might be true also. Next question is, privacy versus public health. This person says it isn't a zero-sum game. But at the same time, I also believe there are some privacy concessions we should be willing to, at least temporarily, make to help prevent the spread. Is this opinion shared amongst privacy activists, or are they unwilling to make any concessions at all?
I think it's useful to go back to human rights law and say that, yes, of course, like during a crisis, fundamental rights can be restricted, but only if a number of conditions are met. And I think it's so important to go back to human rights law because the conditions that are laid out there make a lot of sense. So this, the limit, amongst other things, the restriction has to be necessary. It has to be evidence-based. It has to be time limited. There needs to be oversight. So this is a long list of things that are really sensible. What I'm worried about is that governments are rushing to deploy. They're desperate. They want to be seen as doing something. And there's a great word in German, which is Aktionismus. It's just like looking like, pretend like you just want to be doing something. So I'm worried that governments will deploy technology without evidence that this is actually effective, without the necessary transparency. I find in the UK was quite concerning, the lack of transparency with which certain kinds of tools were being discussed. That's really worrying in a democratic country because I feel like if democracies don't manage to build responsible, trustworthy technology, who will? So sort of like, I think it's also important to send a signal to elsewhere to say, yes, it is possible to build responsible tools. And if we're not backing down, like, you really don't have any leverage to point the finger elsewhere and say, well, you are using this tech irresponsibly. And it is really it's not a trade-off. There are some sort of acceptable solutions that are out there that have already been developed. Yeah,
I like the idea, that word you mentioned, just like someone, you're doing a lot, but you're also not doing anything at all really productive. That's crazy. That's funny. So there are a lot of headlines out there about, they say like, AI is helping fight the coronavirus. But AI can be pretty broad, and also sometimes people misuse the term AI when describing certain things. Does that actually mean anything when you see that, or is it as insane as saying doctors are helping fight coronavirus? What does that tell us more about that?
I think AI has become a frustratingly broad term that is just sort of sometimes used to just mean anything that's data driven. And there were studies. There was a study a few years ago that showed, like 2 years ago, that showed that a significant share of European AI startups don't actually use AI. So there's a lot of hype around AI. There's a lot of sort of like snake oil, meaning there's a lot of false marketing. And the thing that I spotted early on, there was a company that claimed they're selling AI-driven cameras that can spot whether you have coronavirus. That's obviously snake oil, because if it was so easy, if you could just point a camera at someone and see if they have coronavirus, we wouldn't need to develop all these tests.
That would be game changing.
That would be a game changer, and this company would be incredibly rich. But sort of the truth is, what this company was offering is like a thermal camera that shows whether someone has a fever, which is sort of, we now know, is just one of the many, many different symptoms that people can, and some people don't have. So sort of like, I think that's a classic example of AI snake oil. And I pivoted my project a little bit in light of everything being canceled. I think we need to get better at recognizing and calling out when the term AI is just used as a form of hype, when it's used as snake oil, and also just calling out blatant pseudoscience, so things that just simply aren't really scientific. So I think it's really, really important to get better at just calling this out. The fact that a company like this can get a media headline that says AI can find out if you have the coronavirus, that's kind of concerning, because it means that somebody didn't go back and check. It's like, is that something AI can actually do? Like, what is this company actually doing?
Yeah, I'm afraid to find out if there's anyone working right now on a coronavirus detection app to like scam people to like make millions. That's my fear.
But it's also like, it's just something sort of a camera cannot detect. It's just sort of like categorically that not possible. It's sort of, you can find out if someone has a fever, but that's not, I mean, we already have a fever detector. It's called a thermometer, right? Everybody has a thermometer, and you can find out if you have a fever, but that's not a diagnosis. Sort of, it takes more than that. It's sort of like, you need to just, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm picturing an app that just says, like, you hold up a selfie and it says Frederike coronavirus, is bright red, just like, yeah, but that doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't make any sense. But I think some of the in the shortage of testing that still exists in so many countries, some of the contact tracing apps I've seen around the world, some of them allow you to don't say, well, I have tested positive, but let you take a test and answer some questions. And that comes with its own challenges, because it really depends on, are these questions good enough to really diagnose you? Is this sufficient? And then what does it mean, sort of, if you've been in contact with someone who filled out a questionnaire that has a very different way than you've been in close contact with someone who actually tested positive? So again, going back to all the legal protections that are necessary, what happens when your app shows, well, I've been in contact with someone? Does it mean that the government restricts your movement for, like, what are the consequences? So all of these things really need to be sure that the human rights aren't being violated unjustifiably and disproportionately and arbitrarily and against certain kinds of people, not others. Yeah.
Yeah. We have a question from, go ahead.
If you think about it, like, if you don't have a phone on your own, if you share your phone with others, which is the reality for many poor people in the world, it means your chances are also higher of getting in touch with someone, because it's several people carrying this around. So there are all these sort of questions around this.
Yeah, like you said before, like the assumptions, that's going to mess you up right there. Question from Leon Yin, shout out to Leon. Do you know of any surveillance companies or other companies that make oppressive technologies that are pivoting to COVID detection?
I've seen this more at the beginning, I mean, from a European perspective or like a US perspective, in March. So in mid-March, there were a lot of companies pitching the NSO Group. So that's a very controversial Israeli spy company that also builds the Pegasus spyware. They were pitching a software that uses mobile phone data to predict the spread of the virus. Palantir, sort of a company that also offers predictive policing tools and works with police departments. They've been pitching in technology. What I mentioned already, the camera the AI detecting coronavirus surveillance camera. So I think going back to the second question about 9/11, this isn't inevitable because it actually logically doesn't make that much sense. But of course, there's a huge interest. A lot of companies are struggling at the moment, and everybody's trying to think, how can we adapt? And so is the surveillance industry. So for the surveillance industry, they're like, perfect. We need to monitor, like, we can pitch to governments that you need to monitor everyone, that you need to, trace their location. So I think this is something that civil society and anybody who cares about these issues really needs to monitor closely and call out when it's happening.
Every time you mention that camera app, I'm just like picturing like the idea of a Corona camera app. Oh my God, I just can't. There's a question here, and we're getting towards the end of this, not quite at the end right now, but getting towards the end. Question from Twitter @RightlyData. Will data regulators be less likely to penalize companies? And what can consumers do to better protect themselves from their data being misused?
I always like to stress that there are many countries that don't have any laws, and many countries that do have laws don't have regulators who are independent and sufficiently funded to actually enforce the laws. So that's a huge problem always. I think in some of those, so I do think in Europe there is an enforcement gap, and that is a problem. But the problem is also that we live in a world that's made of data. Everything is data. So these regulators, they're not staffed and funded enough to investigate every single app out there and to respond to every complaint there is. So that is a huge problem. Part of the question was also, what can I do to better protect myself? And I never sort of, I don't like, I sort of like, I know that this is a very common question because people want to be able to do something. They want to know how to protect themselves. But I'm always very careful to blame people because they're the weakest link in the chain. And it can't be our full-time job to protect ourselves. And I always like to say, when you go to a restaurant, you don't bring a testing kit to test whether back when you still could go to restaurants, you wouldn't bring a testing kit to test whether your meal is safe. You just trust that you don't get food poisoning. But we don't have the same with tech. Sort of, I would like to live in a world where you can just purchase a service, a product, and you can trust that it doesn't exploit your data. But sadly, actually, the opposite is true. Most products, even the ones you pay for, still share your data with advertisers in ways that are really hard to understand. And I think that's what we should be asking, not what can I do to protect myself, but how can tech generally become more trustworthy?
Yeah, it's such a good point. I mean, like you buy food and like at least at the grocery store, there's like nutrition facts. But when you like sign up for a website, you could go inside the privacy policy and like read through all the legalese, but it's just like it's not easily done. Next question.
But even if you,
Oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
but even if you do sort of like, I sometimes do this because this used to be my job. Even then, it's not always clear. Like
Right.
when I use a health app, I really read the privacy policy. And sometimes I'm like, very vague language. I know that this opens up lots of doors, but I don't really know what the app is doing. And that's just a problem.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like you buy some cookies and you can say, okay, 5 grams of sugar. That's very easy to understand. You like go through the privacy policy and you read it and it's like, wait, what did I just read? Like you just don't know. So one of the last questions here, as the benefit is from Front Porch CS on Twitter, as the benefits and popularity of telemedicine and telehealth become, they're now like abundantly clear why we should have that, especially for older adults. When it comes to COVID-19, what privacy and security issues should we be concerned about when it comes to telemedicine and telehealth?
That's a very specific question. When it comes to older people, there are a lot of barriers to usability. There are many older people who have dementia. That's very challenging. So how do you make sure that older people can use technology? And I've noticed with my grandparents in this crisis, like they're finding it it would be so easy to stay in touch with them, but they're finding it really difficult to use, even with like the larger letters on the phone, they're finding it really difficult to use tech. So the question is sort of like, how can this be exclusive and usable for most people? I'm not an expert on telemedicine. It's sort of any kind of medical use of tech needs to, in the European framework of thinking about this, you're processing health data, and the same in the US, sort of, you have HIPAA, you have laws that govern sort of health data. You're really, really processing sensitive data. So this needs to abide by the highest standards possible, while also being usable. And at the same time, sort of, we all know that online is useful, but it also can't replace everything. Especially when you're sort of old and lonely, it's also nice to see a doctor.
Yeah. This question is from @Rajanio. I probably messed that pronunciation up, on Twitter. So given your background in privacy, what do you think of the limits of the concept of privacy to capture the full range of concerns in tech COVID responses?
People understand the word privacy very differently. And I think my personal understanding of the term is much broader than most people's. For me, privacy is something that is not just about hiding. It's not just about me individually. It's sort of like, it's something that enables lots of other rights. It's something that sort of like, that is also beneficial for collectives and groups. but that's a little bit sort of most people's sort of intuitive understanding of privacy is different. As I said several times before, I think no, privacy is really important in this debate, but it's only one of many rights that we need to be talking about. And the reason why I personally work on privacy, or why I'm very passionate about it, is that I find while it affects us all, it always harms and risks always disproportionately affect certain kinds of people. So if you think about privacy in the broader sense, the way that I think about it, this is really a social justice issue, because it means that, again, sort of like who has cheap phones? Cheap phones have really worse privacy than more expensive phones. And you can find these examples everywhere in tech. So it's really sort of, I care about privacy because I care about justice. But many people's understanding of privacy is about, I just want to hide. And if you frame it in this way, I think this is where the public health versus privacy discussion is coming from, because people think sort of, I need to balance my individual privacy versus a public benefit, versus my understanding is, well, I want to protect people who are most vulnerable while also fighting the pandemic. I think this is where this misunderstanding is coming from. But yes, it's just one of the many rights we have to look out for. And I, as I probably said several times now, I have been a bit frustrated with this privacy versus public health framing, because it's just really not the right question to ask.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And what you mentioned before about like who has a phone, like we're all in the same storm, but the boats are so different.
Yeah, someone smarter said that. I didn't, but I think it really captures this. It's sort of, the virus affects us all, but how we deal with its consequences once we get sick is so vastly different. Sort of whether you can isolate, whether you can get tested, whether you can get access to healthcare, they're just worlds apart. And that's really sort of, that's really just been so evident in this crisis.
Yeah, it's really interesting seeing how Corona has really like surfaced a lot of these problems that have always been there. So this is the last question. I'm going to try to end on an optimistic note, but this is a really heavy talk, so I'm probably going to fail. But going forward, do you see this pandemic changing any privacy norms or other bad tech norms for the better or the worse, but maybe the better since it's optimistic?
I am trying to be optimistic by sort of actually practicing being hopeful. And that's one of the reasons why, together with a friend, I've started a blog that sort of collects things that have suddenly become possible that were previously seen as impossible. And it's really interesting to see across different parts of society, there are lots of actually positive things that governments, that companies are doing in response to the crisis. And for tech specifically, I think the Zoom example is kind of interesting. So the company has had security and privacy issues for a long time, but it's now suddenly become in the media spotlight because so many people are rushing to use their products. And the company then it realized that it needs to change their approach and it needs to prioritize, or that's at least what they announced. We need to check with them whether this is actually happening. But they announced that they're going to prioritize security and privacy over growth and adding new features. And I thought that's a really good lesson for a lot of other companies, especially smaller startups who at the beginning prioritize growth and don't really think about privacy and security. And the company like Zoom is like, if we don't get our act together, we're not going to make this. Sort of like if Zoom doesn't fix these problems, they're in an existential crisis. So I think, yes, I'm hopeful when it comes to many things. But when it comes to tech specifically, I hope the crisis shows sort of the framing of trustworthy technology. So because we depend on tech so much at the moment, we really need tech to be worthy of our trust. And we shouldn't be trusting it blindly. It needs to be built in a way that we don't have to trust it blindly, but that it's sort of, we can trust it with our secrets and our lives and all the conversations we have. So that would be my hope for tech. But also all of these things, so not just in tech, but also sort of like in society at large, this is now a possibility. We can go this way or that way, but it really depends on all of us, which way we're going. And we need to fight for learning from this crisis, not falling into like the war metaphors and mass surveillance, but see this as an opportunity to fix a lot of things. That's sort of my optimism.
That's some good sage wisdom right there. All right, I think that's a wrap. Is there anything else you want to add on top of all that?
No, The only thing would be just one more time on the contact tracing app, there are some really, really good simple explainers that explains how the tech works. And I just really hope that more governments will opt for the decentralized version that is the most responsible that I've seen so far. I think that would be really important because it sets a bad precedent for so many other uses of text. And we're still early in this crisis. We don't know where this is going to take us. And the dystopian potential is endless. So here we have a very concrete problem. We know what the limitations are. We know what the solutions is. I'm just let's just go for the most responsible version.
As you said, dystopian solutions are endless. I pictured the Sound of Music gif with the woman in the field. But yeah, great. That's a wrap. Thank you so much to everyone who followed along, watched live, asked questions, et cetera, et cetera. And a very big thank you to Frederike for sharing her wisdom over the past hour. Thank you for staying with us. Yeah, we're hosting more of these virtual dialogues and debates in the coming months. So follow along at Mozilla. You're welcome to kind of go through the past episodes of dialogues and debates in our kind of library, mozfest.org. And one shout out I have to give is to Jen, Kaltheuner, and the content team. We're nominated for a Webby for Privacy Not Included, so make sure to go vote. But yeah, Frederike, thank you so much for talking to me for an hour.
Thanks so much for all these questions and for everybody for submitting your questions and for listening.
All right. Bye, everybody.